Hey guys, welcome back to another cult movie review. It's me, Bo, here on the Film Scene Investigation channel. Thanks so much for checking out this review. In today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at the 1998 coming-of-age drama SLC Punk, aka Salt Lake City Punk. Now, I didn't even know this film existed up until very recently. I had reviewed the 1995 movie Hackers that starred the actor Matthew Lillard, and then subsequently I went on his Wikipedia page and, checked out his filmography, and saw this movie, SLC Punk, and went ahead, saw the trailer, and it was definitely a movie that, piqued my interest. Just before we get into it, guys, if you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to the channel. All the support is greatly appreciated. So, Salt Lake City Punk from 1998 was written and directed by James Merendino, a filmmaker that had worked on several films before, but SLC Punk is considered his most famous work. As for the narrative, the movie focused on the best friends Steve-O and heroine Bob, who was played by Matthew Lillard and Michael Gorgian, respectively. They were two punks living in Salt Lake City, Utah, living their best life without a care in the world. Their main priority was, to have a good time and just forget about the consequences. These guys were close. They were best friends who shared this shabby apartment together where they discussed the state of the world and how important it was never to sell out. Steve-O, in particular, was dead set against joining the establishment at whatever cost. He really believed in the punk movement, even more so than Bob. We were introduced to their friends like Sean, who was played by actor Devon Sawa, a guy who sold acid on campus. Sean was this punk kid who was, his behavior was kind of erratic, and I would probably put that down to, long-term drug use. His bright green spiky hair, that was a great look for Sean. It really was. It really suited him. And this was a memorable character that kind of popped in and out of the story as it went on. There was also their German drug dealer friend called Mark, who was played by actor Til Schweiger, a guy who, on the outside, he seemed pretty easygoing, but behind closed doors, he was a paranoid man who was in hiding. The only reason Mark was in Salt Lake to begin with was because he owed a lot of money to some people back in Miami. He was laying low. I gathered that both Steve-O and Bob didn't really like Mark too much, but given Mark, was a drug supplier and Steve-O took a lot of drugs, he felt it was important to, at least pretend that they were friends. I mean, it wasn't like Mark, was into punk rock or anything like that, He didn't dress like those guys, he stuck out like a sore thumb every time he was hanging out with Steve-O and Bob. But, he was a drug supplier, and those were the circles that he mixed in. Now, the actual story structure of SLC Punk was all over the place, It didn't follow your standard story structure. But then again, that also did mirror the whole punk ethos. At times, the story was very fragmented, almost episodic, but this approach did kind of continuously, push the pace going forward, and at no time, was I bored or restless. The movie also featured several direct-to-camera monologues from Steve-O that were humorous, but also very cynical. Steve-O's breaking of the fourth wall, it did kind of break down that barrier between character and the viewer, and it definitely gave the film a lot more of a personal touch. There was a subplot that involved Steve-O's dad, who was played by actor Christopher McDonald. He went behind his son's back and applied for Harvard Law School on his behalf. The dad just assumed that this whole punk thing that his son was into, well, it was a phase, and hopefully he would eventually grow out of it. Steve-O would end up being accepted into Harvard Law School, but once he found out, he did not want to go. Steve-O felt that if he did attend the law school, well, he would be going against everything that he believed in. He would be selling out. Yeah, he wasn't mad about it, you know. He loved his dad and his dad loved him. So that was pretty clear to see. It's just ultimately he couldn't accept the offer and so he refused. But this storyline would tie into the ending of the film when we saw the character Bob accidentally overdose on drugs and die. It was a completely random moment that Steve-O didn't see coming. You know, there was his best friend and he was gone. Steve-O, of course, was upset. He broke down, he cried, but it was at that moment that Steve-O finally realized that it was time to leave this lifestyle, this punk ethos, you know, this whole movement. He had to move on. With his best friend now dead, you know, there was nothing keeping Steve-O from staying in Salt Lake. And in a way, Bob's death kind of gave freedom to Steve. He could now take that offer to Harvard Law School and not feel guilty about, you know, supposedly selling out. The final scene of the movie saw Steve-O, now with a shaved head, attending Bob's funeral and admitting to the audience that deep down he was a poser all along. He was someone that really believed in that culture, someone that, you know, lived that lifestyle. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it was all bullshit, just like the idea itself. I really did like this ending, and I appreciated the closure that we got. You know, it was like seeing Steve-O, this chapter in his life closing, and this new one beginning. Now, one of the main themes in SLC Punk was the whole idea around individuality and conformity. You had these characters who embraced the culture as a way to rebel against the norms. But, you know, ultimately, they were just conforming to the ideals of punk. They all adopted the typical fashion styles that are associated with punk, you know, with the dyed hair, the leather jackets, and the Doc Martens. But that in itself was just another type of uniform that the guys felt they had to adhere to. They were doing it all for the wrong reasons, you know? They weren't punk at heart. You know, they just jumped on that bandwagon because ultimately they just wanted to rebel. The film exposed the stupidity of that belief system, with Steve-O's journey, you know, forcing him to confront the idea that his youthful defiance indeed was just a phase. And, you know, for me personally, I really appreciated the director for not, you know, glamorizing the culture and showing the real life consequences if someone were to live that lifestyle. When it comes to the performances, I have to say that Matthew Lillard as Steve-O, he was perfectly suited to play that character. Steve-O wasn't just a rebel, but he was also a philosopher, you know, a guy that used his college education to articulate his disdain for how the world was. And Lillard's ability to shift between the comedy and the moments of quiet introspection, you know, that made him a very likable protagonist. I've seen a fair few Matthew Lillard movies over the years, with Scream being my, favourite of his. But honestly, after seeing what he was able to deliver in SLC Punk, his performance, his portrayal of Steve-O is now my favourite of his. I thought the actor Michael Gorjan did a pretty good job with his role as heroine Bob. His character, had a tough exterior, but inside, he was a lot more sensitive, but still very loyal to the punk movement. Bob was also straight edge, meaning he didn't touch drugs at all. And I have to say, I really loved that characterization, that trait that they gave the character, because ultimately it gave him a lot more depth. While Steve-O and his other friends were more than happy to indulge, Bob was dead against that. He was straight edge. And in doing so, he was almost rebelling against the punk lifestyle of, excess and debauchery. Gorjan was another great casting choice, as he and Lillard, just had some brilliant chemistry, bouncing off each other. It felt so natural. They really felt like genuine friends. And given that this story was so character driven, it was pivotal that the filmmakers, were able to capture the right dynamics for the movie. As for the technical side of things, SLC Punk was a very creative piece of filmmaking, with the director incorporating loads of, different ideas and techniques. I loved the whole editing style, with the quick cuts and the POV shots, and even, the breaking of the fourth wall. Now, understandably, seeing it in today's eyes, it is somewhat dated. But, thinking back that this was a movie from 1998, all that was pretty cutting edge back then. In particular, I thought the film's opening titles were genius. They were a really, really creative idea, with these fake album covers popping up on screen with the, cast and crew labelled over it. As someone who used to own a large number of punk records back in the day, seeing these covers, they looked pretty convincing. Opening titles, they're a little hit and miss. Sometimes they can be great, and sometimes they could be horrible. In this case, though, I was really impressed. And for me, it felt like a tribute almost, rather than, some sort of like mock-up kind of cliche type thing. And talking of album covers, I should take a moment now to talk about the awesome soundtrack that featured some amazing bands like The Specials and The Ramones. It was almost like the soundtrack in itself was a character, that was constantly driving the pace and, shaping the atmosphere of the story. A movie like SLC Punk was always going to need a brilliant soundtrack, to accompany it. And I'm just really glad that the filmmakers were able to nail it in this case. A brilliant selection of punk tracks. Before we get to dislikes, I should also take some time to talk about the brilliant fashion that was on show in this movie. If you're like me and a fan of the whole punk aesthetic, then, seeing all the different looks from all the different characters, is something that, you appreciate. Steve-O's fashion in particular was a real highlight, with all the different colourful blazers and t-shirts and stuff he wore. He had the dyed hair, the razor blade chain. He looked the part, and it looked authentic. It didn't seem like it was cosplay. If I'd been working on this film, I would have definitely, asked if I could have taken some of the clothing home. And if they'd said no, I probably would have stolen it anyway. I mean, come on, even Bob's fashion was pretty good at times. I mean, he had that white zipped up jacket with the Anarchy logo on it. Awesome stuff, man. I'd love to, get my hands on that item. Yeah, I mean, the fashion aesthetic, it felt like a love letter to that whole style. And so, dislikes for Salt Lake City Punk from 1998. My biggest dislike for the film would be a technical one when it came to the shot of Bob and his dead body. So I've already mentioned that we saw Bob at the end of the film overdose, he died, and Steve-O found him in their apartment. Now, my specific issue was the close-up that was used on Bob's face. You see, the camera lingered on this shot, and very subtly you could see the actor's throat rising up and down. Like I said, this is a small issue, it didn't ruin the film, and it really is a nitpick, it's not even really a dislike. But as someone who, edits videos and stuff like that, it just seemed a little bit sloppy. That easily could have been changed, it could have been removed, could have been altered, rather than just being left in. And yeah, I mean, to be honest, it did stick out to me. It was a very important scene, a very compelling scene, but the execution just was a little off for me, and it was something that kind of took me out of the moment. I think if I was the editor, I probably would have used that close-up once and then cut to Steve-O and just had him, emote. That would have been, I think, a lot better than what we got, but is what it is. And so, ratings for Salt Lake City Punk from 1998. I'm going to be rating this movie a strong 7 out of 10. SLC Punk was a thoroughly enjoyable movie, a great coming-of-age 90s drama that I deeply regret not seeing earlier, with the quirky dialogue, the memorable characters, the bold visuals. This really is a piece of cinema that deserves all the praise. And, viewing this film for the first time, it did make me think about all of my kind of friends in the past that I've, kind of lost contact with over the years. And yeah, I mean, those guys would love this film. I just wish I'd seen it earlier. I really, really do. In a way, it kind of reminds me of the film Trainspotting, another 90s film that, explored these issues that young people deal with, finding identity and handling responsibility. I think one of the best things I can say about this film was that it had a lot of heart. There was a lot of emotion laced throughout the whole story. And it was a story that spoke to me. It was something that I could really relate to. So, I loved it. If you've seen SLC Punk, please let me know your thoughts and memories in the comments section below. For those who haven't out there, it's a big recommendation from me. I think especially for, Gen X and, millennials, if you haven't seen this yet, definitely watch it. I think you'll love it. And well, that's all from me today, guys. I do hope you've enjoyed this review of Salt Lake City Punk from 1998. I'll be back next week with another cult movie review. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, take care.